to the book launch event for Professor Edward Kolodziej's most recent book, Global Governance, Evaluating the Liberal Democratic Chinese and Russian Solutions. Before we jump into the book discussion, I'd like to say a few words about our illustrious speaker. Dr. Kolodziej is the founding director of the Center for Global Studies and also the founding director of the program in arms control, domestic and international security at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Currently, he's an emeritus research professor in political science and has written extensively throughout his career on security, foreign policy, and international relations theories. His books include French international policy under de Gaulle and Pompidou, the politics of grandeur from 1974, and also include more recent titles on governing globalization, challenges for democracy and global society from 2016. And that's only to name a few. So we're honored to have Professor Kolodziej join us today to discuss his most recent book, a further investigation on the issues of global governance. And this focuses on evaluating the liberal democratic and Chinese and Russian solutions to these issues. Today's format is going to be more in a moderated discussion, and we're pleased to have joining us Professor Paul Diehl, who is Henning Larsen Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Illinois, and also the Ashbel Smith Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Texas, Dallas. The event is being recorded and will be available on the CGS website later. And also, we will have a question and answer session in the last 15 minutes. So if you do have questions, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the event, and I will moderate those questions after the discussion with Professors Kolodziej and Diehl. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and give the floor to our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Steve. Ed, fascinating kind of book, and it's great to have this particular conversation with you. For those who are going to be looking at the book and reading it, I think a primer is really needed at the beginning. A lot of your previous work has talked about this concept of OWL, which stands for order, welfare, and legitimacy, the kinds of imperatives or things that require solutions in the international system. But assuming that, not everyone watching, attending today or watching this later has read that kind of work, I think I'd like to have you give a little bit of an overview of what each of those things mean, because the rest of the book uses that framework to compare Western democracy, Chinese and Russian solutions. So could you tell us a little bit about OWLs?
Yeah, I'll try. I conjecture in the book that every human society, from the Aborigines until the present global society in which we're all connected as 7-8 billion people, have to sustain that society through governance. So what is governance? And I've come to the view that every human governing system has to respond to three imperatives that are competing. The first one is, where do you set in the society overwhelming violence that is legitimate to separate and arbitrate differences? Look at the truckers' strike in Canada. It was solved essentially by the police. Look at Lincoln in the Civil War. Was it going to be the states or was it going to be the federal government that would have the final authority to arbitrate differences? The next problem is every society to sustain itself has to have people who are fed, who have clothing, who have shelter, who have a healthy environment of some sort of both health and a physical environment. And that imperative breeds different rules than those that are involved in pure security, which is violence. And the obvious example is the Civil War. You can see it in different ways, but one part of the War of the South was a plantation system built on slavery, entirely different kinds of rules. The North was a free labor, industrialization, and that bred different kinds of rules of how the society would respond to the need for people to have food, a shelter, clothing, and a future that had increasing wealth. The next problem you face, and you go back to the Greek dialogues for this, is of the people who first established or set that issue before us. Who's going to rule? Who has the right to tell you what to do? And that legitimacy imperative has had two prongs over time. The first one is, we're going to tell you what to do. Power is itself self-legitimating. And the Chinese government's solution to it, as we'll come to in our discussion, is through the Communist Party, or as I will call the CCP. They're going to tell you what to do because they're self-legitimating. The alternative imperative is it will be by the consent of those who are essentially under rule, a social compact. And that essentially is embedded in the Constitution of the United States.
Okay. So in looking at those three elements, order, welfare, and legitimacy, we don't start with a blank slate. In fact, really since World War II, you're really looking for an established system dominated by Western democratic kind of ideals. Before we talk about how some of those might be eroding or under stress, can you give a little bit of an overview of what the architecture is on order, welfare, and legitimacy from what might be called the Western democratic model?
Yeah, one has to be almost amazed by the Truman-Atchison administration at the end of World War II to have established an architecture that is still in place in principle, if not always in practice. In terms of order, the solution was pooled sovereignty. The states of the democratic states all together joined something called, as we know, as NATO. The United States entered into a whole host of some 42 or so bilateral agreements with other allies. And so the solution to the order problem was a nation state, but a nation state of democratic regimes.
Right, but not,
under
not
conditions
the
of
United, but not the United Nations.
Not the United Nations. Very good, because Article 51 of the United Nations permitted, as you well know, Paul, states to independently organize their security arrangements, but be consistent yet with the terms of the United Nations. The second problem was welfare. Well, protectionism dominated the 1930s. And we all know that that system actually was a bigger thy neighbor kind of policy. And so the European states with the United States as essentially the provider of public goods, Marshall Plan, established what we now know as global markets, free exchange across the boundaries of states, unfettered necessarily except for issues of order by the democracies themselves. And the last issue we faced was legitimacy, and that was simple enough for the democratic states. An acceptance of democracy, which meant that every human, not just Democrats, but a small d, not every human was equal, and if they were equal, they were also free, or vice versa, free and equal. And on that basis, every person had a right to vote, to give consent to who would rule them. And that consent would essentially be ostensibly, one would hope, with free and unfettered elections in which majority rule would be established, but at the same time, civil rights and human rights would be protected for minorities. So
Right.
that was the OWL solution
Yeah,
for Western democracies.
right. But even in terms of coverage, it was never really perfect solution in the sense that you had kind of full coverage. The order kind of solutions didn't necessarily stretch, within spheres of influence or dealing with civil wars. The welfare elements may have been institutionalized by the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization, but they didn't have complete coverage either. And then even over the last 60 years, the number of states who could be called democratic in some sense at its peak never really exceeded 2/3. So, you talk about this being a Western democratic order, but it was in some ways more like Swiss cheese, wasn't it?
Yeah, of course it was Swiss cheese. It was aspirational,
Mhm.
but at the same time, quite practically, it worked. Remember the outcome of the Cold War.
Mhm.
However, let's say, contradictory and hypocritic the United States and the Western states in supporting all sorts of totalitarian or autocratic governments.
Mhm.
However much it in fact always preferred its corporations to competitors. However much democratic states themselves failed, such as Greece with the military in the 1970s. You're right, it was Swiss cheese, but Swiss cheese, hey, it doesn't taste bad. In fact, I like Swiss cheese. And so it beats not having Swiss cheese.
Okay.
And that was the aspirational goal. And one has to, in effect, face the defects of it clearly as an invitation for its improvement.
Right. When we go back and we look to the end of the Cold War, which you alluded to, Francis Fukuyama famously said and wrote a book called The End of History, suggesting that in the grand ideological battles, democracies won over communism and authoritarianism and the like, but 30 years later, that kind of proclamation doesn't quite look as good. And in chapter 3 of your book, you really offer a somewhat pessimistic view of the current state of that kind of Western architecture. Why do you think democracies are under stress? And of course, you're not alone in making that estimation. The decline of democracy, not just in the US, but in places such as India, Hungary, Poland, Western Europe, has been the subject of lots of discussion. What's going on there?
Just a quick note on Fukuyama. I'm always baffled that he should have, in effect, said the liberal democracies were going to win. Even a casual look, read Mark Juergenmeyer's work on religions, or any of the people who work in that field, realize that though we are a global society defined by interdependence, nobody's going to solve global warming. Nobody's going to solve COVID. Nobody's going to solve issues of haves and not haves without, in effect, coming to terms with a world's population divided against itself by culture, religion, language, national, tribal, ethnic loyalties, race. You go on with the fissures. So anybody in 1990 saying that everybody's going to go a liberal democracy, well, one has to be careful what adjectives one uses, but it certainly didn't map with any casual examination of the world societies grouped into the various divisions that we had. Now we get to the question you raised. It was a sharp interim in which the democracies gained hegemony, if you will, within the national system with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the slow rise of China. But two prongs, it seems to me, are a quick answer within the short time we have of why we're at 6s and 7s. First of all, it seems to me the genius as well as the difficulty of democracies is that they're fundamentally fractious with respect to group politics and their government. The American government itself was set up to be fractious, to, in effect, provide a barrier against a majority that would be oppressive, separation of powers, federal system, the whole bit. Well, that is a very difficult kind of government to bring together to deal with global problems, which seems at times to be beyond the pale of interest of the people within the country itself. And these problems we know. I was talking to my wife yesterday at the table. I said, here we sit in the middle of a cornfield and we're worried about Ukraine, and we should, because it may mean the end of the kind of life we know if it comes to a war. So the first answer is the formidable nature of the problems we face with a government that has also the virtues of support for individual rights and freedoms is itself a major obstacle for collecting together not only America, but all Western democracies, or those who in effect are democracies in Japan and South Korea, to deal with the problems they have at home, much less collectively dealing with the problems at a global level. The second one is, let's face it, the authoritarian populist governments of Russia, Venezuela, Turkey, Poland, and Hungary at the moment, and counting, are gaining. Secondly, we have governments like Cuba, Vietnam, and of course, most formidable of all is China, who do have, certainly China does, and the book is dedicated to that issue, has its own solution for global governance, partly justified by the very fractious nature of democratic politics.
Okay. Talking back to predictions back in 1990 and others, around 1990, the best-selling book in Asia and second on the New York Times bestseller list in the United States was a book written by two Americans called The Coming War with Japan. And defining that 30 years ago was an argument that said that, in the next 21st century, the major competitor with the US, the potential for war, et cetera, in your view, the new vision for the order is going to be a competition between the United States and Japan. Well, 30 years later, that looks ridiculous. But it wasn't long, maybe a decade after that, that China replaced Japan in that kind of narrative. And scholars and policymakers then began to talk about two particular visions. One was a vision of China's rise as a great power, where they could become part of the system, in a sense, part of the liberal democratic owl that had existed. And then there was a more pessimistic view that went to the other extreme, that saw China as not just becoming a rising power, but a direct competitor. And there were projections that there will be some type of major power war in 2050, which is an interesting projection for war 40 years ahead, right? You devote 100 pages of your book, far more than you do to the Western liberal architecture or the Russian views to that. And certainly in the discussions that are held in national capitals, including Washington, the US pivot toward Asia for its defense policy and military orientation are all geared toward China as not becoming part of the Western democratic system, but a clear competitor for it, although you're not necessarily as pessimistic in projecting war for that. Why do you see China as so important as the major competitor? And, in 30 years, will we look back and say you got it right?
I'm not sure. First of all, I'm not going to predict anything. The book is dedicated to telling you what your problems are, and global governance is the theme of the book. And the why China gets so pride of place in the book is that it does have, under Xi Jinping, and even actually Deng Xiaoping earlier, and even Mao, a view of global governance in which China would be central to it. And with under Xi Jinping, just to quickly put they do have a model that they not only have, but they are insistent on exporting it. The first one is no alliances. All alliances are an invitation to warfare. All states should be on their own sovereign base, so to speak, every ship on its own bottom, if you want to put it that way. And so the first principle is the nation state system is fine, and we're going to do very well in it because we're going to be powerful and advanced in it. The second point, which somewhat contradicts that first point, is there's a sphere of influence. And that sphere of influence is our Monroe Doctrine. It's called the South China Sea. That poses two issues. One, influence and control all of its neighbors. China has multiple neighbors in excess of 10. And its point is that it has privileged position to essentially influence those states and control the South China Sea, over which much of the world's energy passes, not to mention any number of other issues, things of importance. And that means, will those seas be open and free, that's the US in Western position, or are they going to be under Chinese control? And the third point is basically there won't be a nuclear war because the Chinese first have established what is called a mutual assured destruction policy. If they're struck, they have enough supposedly still remaining nuclear weapons that they would destroy any oppressor. So that deterrence precludes a nuclear war. So under that canopy of nation states and the rising China dedicated, and it's moving very with dispatch to equaling the United States in military power, and proposals before I hear that bing, and I'll try to get on with it, but they are well on their way to controlling the regional area of the South China Sea. Now, in welfare, ironically, one could even say, and we can talk about this as an irony, they're proponents of free market system. But with what I would call Chinese characteristics, that means state capitalism, all control of private enterprise, intellectual property is what they say intellectual property is. I can go on, but the deviations from rule-based is on it. And the legitimacy, this is a key point that I don't think people understand as fully, and why I wanted to write the book. The Communist Party in China should be separated in one's thought. As far as the CCP is concerned, it is China. Its power is self-legitimating simply by its capacity to survive, end years of humiliation, and bring China into the world as a global power. No China without CCP. And if it needs any kind of legitimacy in practical terms, it's something called performance legitimacy. We produce lots of wealth. We got over 500 million people out of poverty. You tell me any other country that even came close to that, the Chinese would argue. So legitimacy has a practical element to it. And absent that, power will will out. That's called the CCP.
Okay, well, we're going to come back to kind of China again, but I also don't want to forget the third leg of the stool, and that's Russia. And when you devote a chapter to Russia, one of the impressions I left with at the end of that chapter was that sort of the Russian solutions under Owl in its vision for the world are much narrower, selfish, if you were, than a more expansive Western democratic or even Chinese kind of view. I mean, is the Russian solution really a global governance solution, or is it really just a solution for Russia in its immediate neighbors?
You're right. That's why I devoted only one chapter versus three for China. If you want to put it in quick terms, it's looking through your rear mirror, That's a return back to an aspiration to be a global power, but as a matter of fact, limiting itself to being having a sphere of influence within the region. That's where we're involved with the, Ukraine. As far as welfare is concerned, they're a free rider. They depend on global markets to move their gas, oil, and minerals. After that, California has a larger GNP than all of Russia. Russia's about 12th, California is 5th. And they're not going to provide any public goods like the United States. And as a matter of fact, public goods that China is providing is something called the Bridge and Road Initiative. Mm-hmm. So, and welfare, they're really parasites because it's a kleptocracy, as a matter. And the last element of legitimacy is it's a what is now called a populist authoritarian government. They're going to have elections, but they're going to be rigged, or sometimes they could even win those elections. But basically, it's a system that's authoritarian from the top down. And Putin, of course, is in office for 22 years, winning some elections, rigging some, and of course, squashing all forms of dissent. Navalny, his major opponent, is wallowing, and of course, in a Russian jail.
Yeah, I mean, both China and Russia have tried to make inroads in South America, Central America, as well as Africa, but they've done it in sort of very different ways. The Chinese model has been to grant loans or other kinds of financial assistance to build ties with China for economic and resource purposes, in many ways to try and export the Chinese model. Russia, the thing that they're doing is providing mercenaries or other kind of assistance.
Little green people.
To crush opposition, but there's not really the same kind of building kind of economic ties. There's no model there that goes with that. Is that a fair estimate?
Yeah, that's why you said it's three-stooled. Look, it's a wobbly two pegs on that stool. They have a pretense as a global power, and therefore argue that they have a right to be at the table of any issue facing the global society as a whole through their position membership on the in the UN and the and so that's an aspiration, if you wish. But you're right; it's primarily a regional power at best, and of course, it has difficulty really achieving its Monroe Doctrine, and Ukraine now is a touchstone of that. And it provides, as I say, no public goods to support the larger problems of both security, except locally by helping people in Venezuela arm themselves and the like. But the Chinese are extremely, I think, imaginative and resourceful in providing an alternative to the Western model under Chinese terms.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think the difference. It made me think of Joseph Nye's concept of soft power. As much of the influence of the democratic model was supposed to come from the success and the emulation of others who look to that democratic kind of model. China sort of pushed some of the same thing, emphasizing sort of the welfare kind of aspect, along with the, to leaders, you can improve the welfare, at the same time of retaining political power. I don't see any soft power from Putin. Literally,
he doesn't have any.
No, but I don't see that as a particular goal for that. That this is a new model of internal governance or spread, and things are more closely tied to the Russian homeland than they are to any other particular kind of idea per se.
Yeah, a quick reaction would be they're under fundamental crisis, I would say, both as a state, as a regime, and Putin personally. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, where are the boundaries of Russia? It remains a problematic problem. The regime is fundamentally under stress by the example of economic development and political freedom, including now a tendency of the Ukrainians to move in that same direction. Nothing is more challenging to that regime as well as the Chinese regime, the fact that people could be successful and be free.
Yeah,
Like
right.
Taiwan, for example, is an emblematic problem for mainland China, because there's a free Chinese people with indigenous people in Taiwan. At the same time, they're the leading chip maker in the world.
Right. No, I mean, it's funny that the threat that one commentator in the last week I read identified and said, the threat to Russia isn't so much NATO per se, because we know NATO is really not going to spend Ukraine. It's Ukraine and some of those others joining the EU.
Yes, absolutely.
That point was a much bigger ideological kind of threat than NATO on its borders.
Yeah, its major threat is precisely on the grounds of legitimacy. And in some ways, he logically should be moving to control as much of Ukraine as possible, however troublesome that is for everyone else, including the Ukrainians, because it is a threat both to the autocratic regime that he's cobbled together, and one wasn't even sure that it's going to will succeed him, since they haven't solved a consensus within the Russian people. And of course, his own personal stature is at stake, as he sees himself in the golden years now, thank you, in which his assertion of power is necessary for his own legitimacy by invading or intimidating all the countries around him. So I deliberately, I was trying to get people to get off a Russian kick and focus on the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is not to say that the Ukrainian crisis is trivial and important, and if it's handled badly, there goes Western democracies, as we know, in the architecture of Europe and more generally. So I'm not dismissing that as a problem. But if you look at it from the point of view of the next 20, 30 years of a interdependent global society and who's going to populate it, China is a much more formidable adversary and competitor, because the mad strategy they have adopted in nuclear affairs is to preclude a nuclear war, because there is no way that you're going to have any Chinese. In fact, they renounced first use of nuclear weapons, where the United States and Russia have not, because it's the framework, if you will, for emphasis on material development, hence the bridge and road initiative, as well as the superiority of an authoritarian system to deal with problems that a fractious Western peoples can't handle their own domestic problems. God knows less the global problems we face.
Okay, let me just shift a little bit of emphasis here. As one reads through your book, there's a lot of emphasis on the importance of leaders. Trump in the United States, Deng Xiaoping, President Xi in China, Putin in Russia. One could even extend it, if one wants to look at other global trends, to Prime Minister Modi in India. You want to go to Orban in Hungary. I mean, there's a sense there that leaders matter a lot. And I want to, but leaders aren't going to last forever, even though Putin and Xi are not going to go anywhere for a while. I think someone reading your book is going to want to know to what extent are these leaders and their directions driving these kind of changes? And if they are, will the next leaders then be ones that go with that flow, ride those waves, or is there potential for doing more? And then I want to return to this, your last chapter about what comes next. Go ahead. Leaders.
Yeah, Thomas Carlyle, great men are the ones that run things. It's hard to argue against what you're saying, at least initially, no communist victory in 49 without Mao Zedong, no change in economics without Deng Xiaoping, no end of the Civil War without Lincoln, FDR saves capitalism in the 19th. One can go on, all right? And we haven't even mentioned de Gaulle yet. I tend, in the book underlying it, see mass movement of peoples on which leaders emerge and draw their power from as the dominant source of movement in history rather than great men. And just a quick anecdote, there's this fellow having his Pernod at a French cafe, and a mob runs by, and he tells the waiter, he says, hold my Pernod, I've got to run and lead that mob. That tends to be, in a nutshell, my view of history, such as it is, as the large movements of peoples in different circumstances, out of which leadership arises as a necessary element for direction and preservation, flourishing, and replication of that society. But I'm a small d Democrat, which then projects itself on a global scale. And that is partly why the chapter 3 deals with the erosion of the liberal democratic. It doesn't work without massive engagement of humans to want to save a country for democracy. And the United States and its population now has a major anti-democratic movement. Can do the polls, but somewhere maybe on for. And you have a Republican Party that is essentially anti-democratic. And whether there'll be sufficient civic engagement, because to deal with a problem, let's say global warming, is an enormously complex policy issue, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you have to spend also a lot of your time maintaining a popular, open government. And do we enough as a society have enough energy, commitment to, in effect, provide the kind of support for the kind of government that I laid out, that we all know that once existed, or at least an aspiration? I don't know. I don't have. I tend to be naively optimistic that we will get through this.
Maybe, but and we're getting close to sort of the end of our discussions and moving to question and answer. But if I just read chapter 3, I'd be pretty discouraged. It's quite pessimistic about the erosion of kind of the Western democratic institutions. And then we move into the Chinese view of Mao and the Russian views. I got to the end of the book and thinking, whoa, it's the end of history. But then I read your last chapter, and to paraphrase somebody else, it's sort of what is to be done, not by Lenin, but what ways can, in a sense, Western democracies in that model, snatch victory from defeat. Can you be a little bit more optimistic here at the end and say a few words about some things that you outline, the kind of actions that would be useful that you outline in the last chapter?
That's a tall order in a short space. I just have a massive assurance that there's nothing more powerful than human freedom. Once you get it, you don't want to lose it. And I consider that force. And there are examples of it. The end of the Soviet Union wasn't by guns. It was people saying, we're not going to live under that kind of order. Now, they all slipped by. Poland and Hungary are a populist authoritarian government. So I remain optimistic that as long as we continue to emphasize the importance, value, and I think it's just natural that people are free and equal once they realize it. Okay, that's the one positive thing. 2, hey, we're not exactly a paper tiger, for Christ's sake. We got an enormous military capabilities, economic, technological power. The Chinese just stole most of this stuff. They still haven't learned innovation as we have. And they're running a capitalist system that kills innovation, quite frankly, by dominating it politically. So I'm not optimistic that if we can harness the commitments, we can, what? We're not going to rule the world. It's too divided against itself. What you want to do is expand the number of regimes that are democratic to have at least that enclave for people to be free, equal, and express themselves and bring other people in that want to be there. But you're not going to have world global governance. The whole point, again, of the book was forget it. It's not going to happen. We're too divided against each other. So at least get the democracies in order. That's the next point. It's not helpful to just talk about NATO and Europe. What we now need is to almost rehearse back to World War II, to think in terms of the globe as a whole as a security problem, and bringing all the Western Europe and Eastern countries and Latin, all those who can meet minimal tests of democracy, into increasing discussion such that all of those states meet periodically. And that means just discussions at the beginning. There's too much hostility and skepticism about too grand a beginning. But don't focus the problem of governance and the vitality of the democracies purely in regional terms. I'll just end with that. It has to be increasingly seen as a strategic problem, the same way, as a matter of fact, that World War II was handled.
Okay, thanks, Ed. I'm going to turn this back over to Steve Witt. He's going to moderate some of the questions and answers. And as he indicated in a chat, is if you have some questions or comments, please put those in the chat space, and Steve will be your go-between or conduit in the conversation with Ed. Thanks, Ed.
No, thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. It was very kind of you to participate.
Thank you, Paul. And this has been a wonderful conversation, and really helps to set the stage for some of the questions we have in the Q&A. So Ed, I'll read these off for you and give you a moment to answer them. The first, and there's two that are associated with this question, is how can democracy itself evolve to overcome the challenges leading to its current erosion? And related to that, what are the prospects for sustainable democratic systems in an open society moving forward?
Well, I'll try to be brief because people have questions. Well, it's got to be the youth. We have to galvanize those people. Those of us at my age are screwed up enough. And those below, even more so, I would feel, with Vietnam and the entry into Iraq and all of that. And there has to be more emphasis on civic learning, and not civic indoctrination. We all know all the problems we're having now with the so-called racial theory and whatnot. You got to face our own history, but really it is a revolutionary history, as well as that of the French, to realize that the humans can actually govern themselves. That was not the norm until the end of the 18th century. And recognize that it has massive weaknesses and also massive faults, but the alternatives look a hell of a lot worse. And that's, so I would say the universities, the teachers just have to be firm in bringing out that history and its vitality with respect to its values while recognizing we're all imperfect and God knows we haven't come close to realizing those values. But I'm not about to change Jefferson High School as people were going to do, even though I know he has slaves, okay? I'm not about to give up Washington because it wouldn't have been a revolution without him, even though both of them had slaves. It's just to me, a failure to recognize one's own personal imperfections and then project them on to the society as a whole. But I place a hell of a lot of strength on the youth, partly because I have 9 grandchildren, and I think they're terrific.
Well, related to that, Ed, your colleague Jeannie Lukowski asks a pessimistic question to your answer on the youth, and that's really how do we achieve the common narrative and common understanding of facts, and sometimes simple facts, in this day and age, the advances in information technology, the ease at which we can communicate without filter, it seems to have strengthened authoritarian populism recently, as opposed to strengthening civic engagement in protecting democracy.
There's no simple answer. I guess there was a prime minister of Belgium, and they asked him, "What was your solution to politics?" And he said, "L'audace, l'audace, l'audace." You gotta just keep being outrageous in your support of upper liberal values. At the workplace, in the support of education, when somebody says, ban the books, write a letter, show up to combat it. At a global, at a national level, oppose anti-democratic regimes. I don't know what the solution is, except taking on the responsibility of not letting it happen, even though it'll be costly in time, expenditure, and energy, because that has been the solution, it seems to me, since the formation of the American Republic. Constant, if you just trace its history, it's one of conflict all the way through, and the arc has been towards great over time, as one has used the cliche, towards openness. And that, of course, is precisely what's being the issue before us today. Is it going to be an open society, or you're going to have pernicious people with conspiracy theories, rich people, and I can go on because I just finished an article about the Constitution as a suicide document, because it supports minority factions more than majority factions, thanks to the Supreme Court, the filibuster, and the Electoral College. So yeah, I agree they've got problems, but I'm not about to say that we don't have an ability to address them. And I spent 4 years on this book, partly animated by that very aspiration.
Great. Let's move back into the question of competition between the U.S. and China. There's a question here. How do you see the relationship dynamic between the U.S. and China evolving over the coming decades as economic interests conflict with ambitions of global political influence? And then associated with that, how do you see India playing a role in this conflict? It is the largest democracy we have on the planet.
Well, with China, the quick answer is get away closer. That we are involved and cannot survive either society, Western societies, America, without recognizing that we're in conflict or in competition, and we have to compromise. There's no way about it without avoiding a nuclear war or a war that would erupt, for example. The most hot spot at the moment is the South China Sea. So is recognizing that neither side will get what it wants in terms of values or interests. And each society will be continually challenged as the Chinese challenge us as a model and we challenge theirs. But it has to be understood in mature terms. Tell me what marriage has ever survived simply on universal paramedic terms without compromise, that to give a practical answer to it. Just recognize the infirmities of the relationship and deal with them, because the alternative is just worse: war, penury, sustained internal conflict. I hope I'm answering that question. Oh, about the India presents a serious problem because it's moving now towards an authoritarian populist regime under the BJP, and the elections coming up in which the Congress Party, which had been by and large, with some exceptions, the view that this was a multi-religious, linguistic regional party. India was composed that way. And that the only way to keep the country together was to be neutral, not neutral to religion. All religions were to flourish, but none were to dominate, specifically the Muslims shouldn't be. And to align under the Quad, which is the India, US, UK unit that's now discussing, is one of the compromises. You very likely have to align on pure security grounds with India, while very likely quietly badgering them to move back to the Gandhi position. And from its formation in 47, I did write an article on this recently, a tribute to one of my colleagues, Steve Cohen, who for a Feshlift on, and I did the article is on legitimacy of India, and it has this bifurcation. At the moment, the view of the Hindu culture has taken root, but one hopes that over time it'll return back, at least in some fashion, to the kind of neutrality towards religion, specifically the Muslims, as it has before. But very likely with India, we'll have to, on security grounds, align with them, because we don't have enough power itself in the Indian Ocean without the Indians. But we'll have to deal with the weaknesses of its democratic commitments over time.
Thank you. Another question on China. Previously, you were talking about the fact that China has produced goods, public goods within China, but also global public goods. But yet there's a question from Duncan Clark that states virtually no one wants to immigrate to China except a minority of mostly people of Chinese ethnic origin. They do have some laborers coming in. And despite the Trump administration and problems within the US, millions of people continue to try to get into the US. So in essence, China suffers a kind of image problem, which should be a liability. So can you comment on that?
It's a good question, to say the least. No, nobody's, aside from learning the language, it's not small. But the Chinese elite sends their kids to our university. In fact, the major ideologue in China right now spent his master's degree at Iowa University. And he provides the rationale for the Xi Jinping regime. It's not an attractive society. And in the book, I mentioned a Indian ambassador who put his finger right on it. He said, no one wants to be Chinese if you're not Chinese itself. And let me say, and I don't say this gratuitously, it's a remarkable country. Everybody ought to visit China, quite frankly. It's really dynamic and awesome. But having said that, it does not offer a model for all humans. It doesn't. It doesn't believe that all humans are free, and it doesn't believe that all humans are equal. And on that, anvil, the Western democracies have a winning hand, but they've got to organize themselves, obviously, on facing the problems they also face. And that's, to me, we got those aces, and they have jokers. And we should never allow them to, for any point in time, to say that they have a model superior to ours. Yes, and performance perhaps. They have, for example, with the Bridge and Road Initiative, they have 140 agreements with all countries and with countries in all continents right now. Huawei is way ahead of us in telecommunications in Africa, for example, just to give you some ideas for performance, which we haven't talked about. But they cannot give us freedom and equality. And that, I think, we got a strong hand, but we have to get our act together in order to meet the global problems we all face. Otherwise, the democracy ain't gonna look good.
Well, great. Well, Ed, we've come up to the 1 o'clock hour. So I think this is a good time to close our discussion. I'd like to thank you very much for your comments and discussion on your book. I'd like to thank our attendees as well for their questions, and encourage you to reach out to Ed for further question and dialogue on this topic as well.
You can give them our emails. You're welcome to email if they wish. They can find me at the University of Illinois on the faculty there.
I'll enter your email into the chat, and then people will be able to have that if you want to follow up.
Be happy to respond if people